Hello, and welcome to our webcast. I'm Amy Pendergrass with Moss Adams, and I'm going to get us started for today's session, Adopting the Current Expected Credit Losses Standard. Before we begin, I'm going to play a brief video.
Welcome, and thanks for joining us. We're pleased to present another in our ongoing series of continuing professional education webcasts to help companies and individuals conquer challenges as they plan for what's next. Our presentation will start in a few moments. Before we begin, here are a few things to keep in mind. You can customize how you both view our presentation and interact with the presenter. For better viewing, close all other applications and turn up your speaker volume. You can also adjust window size and placement, or enter full screen mode using the controls at the top of the window or dragging the bottom right-hand corner to resize. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a series of icons, each relating to a different aspect of our session. You can download the group attendance sheet and a PDF copy of today's slides from the slide deck and handouts widget to the right of the slide view. You can ask our presenter questions during the webcast by typing a question in the Q&A window below the slide view and clicking Submit. We'll do our best to answer all questions during the presentation or follow up via email. If you experience technical difficulty during today's presentation, refresh your browser by hitting the F5 key. Today's session will offer you 1 CPE credit. To receive credit, you must meet the requirements as specified by the National Association of State Boards of Accountancy. You must attend at least 50 minutes of the session and respond to at least 75% of the polling questions, which we'll ask throughout today's presentation. To respond to a poll, click the button next to your answer. We'll track your progress and alert you when you've earned CPE credit. You can then click the certificate icon in the CPE Progress widget to open a PDF file that you can save to your computer. Don't worry if you can't download your PDF certificate today. We'll email a copy to you in 2 weeks. If you're attending this webcast in a group, you must complete our attendance sheet to receive CPE credit. The attendance sheet is available in the slide deck and handouts widget. Please have all group members sign it and send only 1 sheet per group. Also note that CPE credit can be awarded only to participants registered as themselves and isn't available to participants who view the on-demand version. As a reminder, the presentation you're about to see isn't legal, investment, or accounting advice. We encourage you to seek the counsel of a professional service provider to apply this content to your specific circumstances.
All right, and now I would like to turn the floor over to today's moderator, Gabe Nachand, partner and Financial Institutions National Practice Leader here at Moss Adams. Gabe?
Thank you, Amy. I'm Gabe Nachand, Financial Institutions National Practice Leader, and welcome today. I'm excited to introduce our presenter. Here are key objectives to meet the CPE requirements, but at the end of the day, we're going to get a great presentation on some of the pitfalls and challenges of implementing CECL. We're expecting over 500 participants today. Most of them are financial institutions, and the presentation is geared as such. With that, I'd like to introduce our presenter, Derek Hipp, co-founder and director of consulting for Valuant, leading CECL software solutions provider. And I will go in the background and manage the questions coming in and interject as necessary, and we'll try to cover as many at the end as possible. And as was mentioned, we will follow up on the ones we're not able to get to. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Derek, invite him to make any additional comments he would like about himself or Valuant, and then get us going. Welcome, Derek, and I turn it over to you.
Appreciate that, Gabe. Appreciate that, Amy, as well, for getting us kicked off here. First off, again, thanks for joining today. The key objectives were outlined, but we'll go through each of those in a great amount of detail and actually have some case study information to work through as well. As a quick introduction, Gabe did note that I am a co-founder and director of consulting at Valuant. We are an accounting and technology services company. You can see off to the right of your screen here the various different services that we do provide for financial services companies throughout the country. We have been through CECL adoption hundreds of times at this point through various different capacities, including assisting implementation of our own software product, but also the review of internal models as well in those situations with some larger institutions that have developed their own services. Guys, the first step that we're going to work through in identifying major pitfalls and adoptions of the CECL standard really begin along the lines of just establishing your implementation plan. Off to the right of your screen, you can see we have a screenshot of a generic CECL readiness plan that our professional services practice offers to various financial services companies that we work with. We do frame that out into 6 different phases. Again, depending on ultimately how you're implementing this project plan may look a little bit different for you, but at any point in time, you're going to have to consider and ensure that you account for all of these various things throughout your implementation. So our first phase is generally exactly that, establishing the roadmap. The second phase is getting data ready, identifying what data needs you have, what data is available, and ultimately how you would get that integrated into a vendor platform if ultimately that would be the route that you would go through. As you guys all know, CECL is a non-prescriptive standard. Fortunately, for everyone that hasn't adopted yet, there has been some guinea pigs that have adopted CECL. And so back, in 2019, where we were working through many implementations for those companies that adopted 1/1/2020, this was a much more vague path, ultimately, than what the group that will be adopting in 23 really has the ability to do. There's a clear path, ultimately, that you could work through. And again, phase 3 is where one of those topics of being non-prescriptive really comes into play. And that's just the different loss methodologies that are available under CECL. Under phase 4, this would be like parallel runs. At some point in time, most organizations have said we want to have at least 2 parallel runs under our CECL framework to compare back to what we're doing during incurred loss. So again, those are very important. Those are practice runs, but they also help identify things that you may not have thought of when you initially set up your models. And the back 2 things really that we generally focus on, and again, no specific order here that you might work through outside of Valuant, but your just disclosure framework for your audited financial statements, GAAP disclosures, and then also regulatory reporting. And then the final piece is just a lot of documentation, which ultimately is one of the pitfalls that we will work into. Now, on average, guys, this is generally a 6-month process, or is proven to be a 6-month process. However, that is not the case for those that are probably adopting currently to date. And what I mean by that is, given that you've got more of that clear path to move forward into, you could really slim down that implementation time frame. We recently had a client come on board, and we got fully to phase 5 here within a month's time frame. So again, we'll focus on several different pitfalls that we've typically seen to be able to expedite that process and deliver on an implementation time frame, that'll really get you off to the races for reporting. Amy, with that, I think we'll move into our first polling question.
All right, let me get this pulled up here. So the first polling question is, how far along is your company in the CECL adoption process? A, collecting data and deploying loss models. B, finalizing forecasting and qualitative factors. C, conducting full parallel runs. D, adopted and reporting. Or E, not applicable. And we will give you a few moments to respond. Please click the button next to the answer you choose and hit submit. And if you can't see the submit button, you will need to just enlarge the slide area to view it. And we'll leave this up another 5 seconds or so to make sure everyone can get their CPE. And I do see quite a few responses coming in through the Q&A window. You will need to respond on the slide itself to receive CPE. All right, here are the results.
Thanks, Amy. Let's look over the results here, guys. Got an almost even split with sections A and B in those responses of collecting and deploying the loss models, and then finalizing forecasting and qualitative factors. In third place here, outside of NA, is doing those full parallel runs. Interestingly enough, both response A and B will be specific pitfalls that we work through in today's presentation, and ultimately I think, again, is going to be what we've typically seen and what you would probably expect moving into CECL. So with that, we're going to go ahead and move forward into the first most significant pitfall, and we've put these somewhat in order, guys, in terms of what we've typically seen and what you all should focus in. And that's limited loss data that you may have when conducting an expected loss model. Generally speaking, with the organizations that we've worked with, most companies are able to source 3 to 5 years worth of reliable historical information. Guys, if you guys think back to the CECL standard and ultimately what it says, again, it's very non-prescriptive. But one thing that it makes clear of is your historical losses may be a basis at which to gauge your future expected losses under CECL. So with that said, generally speaking, a good place to start would be gathering historical receivable level, loan level information. However, most in the financial services industry have not done a good job of having a data warehouse or having this data readily available that would ultimately be required for loss models. Loss models require things like loan types, risk ratings, consumer credit scores, origination balances, origination dates, things like this that, generically speaking, financial services companies have not done a great job of gathering over time. And so it becomes an exercise, typically speaking, when you work through your initial implementation of seeing what data I do have. Have I stored that data for reasons other than expected loss observations? Maybe it's other credit underwriting procedures or credit analysis that I've been doing, and it really works through an inventory. But typically speaking, again, we've only really seen on average institutions be able to receive that data 3 to 5 years, which presents some major challenges as you guys think through your implementation process under CECL itself. And that first challenge is the required of an expectation of expected credit loss. And so the expected credit loss clearly covers on the full expected life of the receivables. And so what that means is, let's say you've got 3 years worth of loss data. We've got an example here, but you've got loans on the books that have an expected life of 7 years. Now, it shows that 7 years as a specific example, because let's say that you have a 30-year loan. Again, what CECL is requiring you to do is not reserve for the next 30 years, okay? So you're going to be doing over the expected life, which is adjusted for prepayment speeds, which on average mortgages are 6 to 7 years historically speaking. And so that's the example. You don't have to have 30 years worth of history, but you will have to have history that you can at least say, look, I can cover the full expected life cycle of a loan portfolio that might exist on my balance sheet date that I'm reserving for today. So again, if you've only got 3 years worth of history that you've observed within your own portfolio, trying to apply that to a lifetime expectation on a 7-year loan, extremely difficult to defend and would not generally be very accurate. Now, the second component that limited loss information or limited look-back information is going to give you is that ability to develop and deploy a reasonable and supportable forecast. And then you have the other concept of reverting back to a long-term average. So if you've only got the last 3 to 5 years worth of data, obviously the pandemic is in there, but generally speaking, there's no loss information available in there. While there was technically a recession, obviously with the general government stimulus and the regulatory relief most institutions took with COVID deferrals, there was no losses actually observed in terms of any type of quantification to be of any magnitude over that time period. So if you only have 3 years worth of loss history, it's very difficult to say that you have observed losses through a full economic cycle. So maybe you say, well, I believe, the next 2 years or the next year is going to be very similar to my last 3 years. Okay, that probably holds up fairly well in a modeling approach. However, what are you going to do about reverting back to your long-term average rates, the long-term loss rates that will be observed over the remainder of that time period outside of your reasonable and supportable forecast? So again, just not having that data there doesn't allow you to answer answer that question very well. And the third point is just when you work through any type of default or loss model, the concept of default events are pretty rare. Obviously, there's a lot of analysis that we work through, but if you think through your own portfolios, the observations of default, statistically speaking, guys, are somewhat rare. In the situations where defaults do occur, that actual loss event can be even more rare. And so when you're looking to smaller data sets without a lot of observation of loss, doing some of these quantifications of models can be very, very difficult. So with that, how do we resolve this issue? If we know it's present in most financial services companies, how do we resolve these issues? So we've got 4 different things to recognize, and then we'll talk through specific examples that we have showing you how this would be quantified and what it might look like. And the first and most important thing that everyone needs to talk about when they're thinking about these pitfalls is understand that most, and again, most, if you think about, I don't have the statistics, but likely upwards of 75% of organizations right now that have adopted CECL and are working through the implementation phase are looking to peer industry data sets. So if we just talked about the fact that I can't observe my own loss history through a full economic cycle, covering the full expected life of my receivables portfolio, and I have very limited loss information just in that time period, the standard does allow to look to relevant outside or external information. And again, because so many people are running into this issue, it's extremely prevalent in reserve models today. So the first step would be to recognize that fact and understand that that exists and would ultimately be an option to you as you're working through your implementation process. The second point that goes hand in hand with that is to assess your data constraints very early on. If I'm kicking the project off and I know that I only have 3 years worth of data that I could even source, and that's going to take me months to clean up, I have to get 2 or 3 resources involved to be able to do it, you're likely needing to move ahead into looking to an industry data set or a peer data set of loss to be able to calculate a reasonable expected loss assumption under ASC 326 or CECL. And again, what we're talking about here is identifying the challenges and the pitfalls that you all are going to run into or that you've probably already run into. And so assessing those data constraints early on allows you to move forward and to really focus in on understanding the model results versus setting up and establishing the model. These are very important concepts because historically speaking, guys, this is a black hole that you can move down when you start mining data that ultimately you might want to use. It's great governance. Ultimately, everyone will have this as you continue to grow. From a regulatory perspective, you will be pushed into having good data governance practices. And even if it's a data point that might not be flowing into a model, still having the correct data in the data warehouse is going to be extremely important to financial services companies into the future. So assessing that ability early on can save you a lot of time, and then recognizing maybe the peer data set might be a situation that I need to move to from a reserving standpoint. The third point here is when you think about industry data sets that exist out there, and there are several that are widely used for the implementation of CECL, typically speaking, they're in 1 of 2 data sets. One, it's a probability of default and a loss given default. Again, that's just taking, for those that don't know, a charge off and breaking it down into 2 different events. The first event is a loan defaults, and the second is of that loan that defaults, there's a charge off that's recognized on that receivable default. The other is just purely charge off rates. One thing that I would like to mention here, guys, as a specific caveat, is ensure if you are looking to outside data sets of charge off rates, you have to consider recoveries. You cannot have a model that does not have recoveries accounted for. That will be something that would come up in a validation or an audit review because it's specifically mentioned in the ASC, and again, it is a full expected loss analysis. So just looking at pure charge-off rates without any concept of a recovery that might be included in that time period, you would have an incorrect model there based purely on the standard. Typically speaking as well, guys, on this point, what this practically means is you're probably applying this to a cash flow model. Now, cash flow model might have a few different names the way you guys have thought about it. Maybe that's a WARM methodology, weighted average remaining maturity, or it's a pure discounted cash flow model. But practically speaking, for those organizations that are using industry data sets of historical loss to project out into the future, the way that you project those balances into the future are generally a cash flow model, or again, in some cases, the WARM model for smaller institutions, if you can establish some type of future expectation, which I think is generically speaking one of the most significant challenges with the WARM model that the cash flow model can just easily account for you guys. Now, the last and final point that I do want to make is I know I've talked a lot about why you might want to look to an industry data set and why an industry data set might check some of those boxes off on the pitfalls. But don't ignore the fact that at some point in the future, you want to have a plan to migrate to your own loss data. This was clearly outlined in an interagency webinar that was hosted on Ask the Fed under the CECL project. And number 26 was, we would prefer, from an organizational standpoint, that you look to your own loss history. So if the regulators, from an interagency perspective, have made it clear that that's a preference, you can easily document why it may not work today. But if you can't answer the question around what is my plan to someone time in the future hopefully migrate to my own portfolio history, that's going to be an issue. So again, as you work through resolving those steps, just ensure you consider a plan in place to establish those. Well, let's move into an example, guys. And we've got two different model banks, or demo banks as we would call them. And both of these are a collection of different organizations just piled together to simulate one portfolio of receivables. Bank A is using their own loss history from 2017 to 2021 within a cash flow model. And again, guys, this is real data set. We've run it through our real models to display to you guys what this ultimately might look like. Bank B is that same collection of institutions, but they're leveraging a peer data set for probability of defaults and loss given defaults within a cash flow model. So same practical methodology for utilizing within the organization, but looking at different periodic historical loss to be able to develop that historical or that expected loss into the future. So let's see what those different assumptions may yield within this particular model. Now, again, reminder on the cash flow model, it accounts for amortization of the loan balances. It accounts for the contractual maturities of those, and it also adjusts back to expected life through prepayment speed assumptions. So, again, fully holistic there, calculating that through. But in the model that's only using the historical loss information to develop the future expectations from 2017 to 2021, the model only yields expected losses of 31 basis points, or $20.3 million. Now, if we use that same data set, but instead source the probability of default and loss given default information from an entire economic cycle, and in this situation, that goes all the way back to 2006, all the way through 2021. So a full economic cycle, a robust data set. You can see what happens in that situation is the expected losses moves up to $75.4 million, or 1.16%. Again, if we just think about the current coverage ratios that exist for those CECL adopters, that 1.16 is more in the range of what a peer analysis might be for a commercial bank currently, within an asset size band of under $5 billion. Right now, I think that number is actually about 109 if you look to those that have adopted CECL. But you can see there that would align more closely, ultimately, with what you're seeing from a peer analytical standpoint. And you guys can see how that might close the gap. Let's look to that same information, but instead of looking at it in a cash flow application, let's make it a little bit more understandable, just charge-off rates, okay? So now we've got the average charge-off rate. Again, these are quarterly charge-off rates, annualized that you would look to of commercial banks with about 90 basis points, which is that first data point you can see in the charcoal colored column. Now, same thing, it's not the same banks, obviously, but just it's offering you this data point in the same analysis. Their average charge-off rate over that time period is only 43 basis points. So again, we compare those back in the last two columns to what the cash flow model might say of 0.31% versus 1.1% for this data set, you can see how those align with the same thing. So what we're trying to offer you here is observations into what a data set might look like, not only in a more complicated method of actual CECL model. Let's just break it down and make it easy and look at historical charge-off rates over that time period. And this right here can easily show you why, if you have to reserve for total expected loss, that peer group data set might ultimately be where you'll decide to move to. One last point I want to make, and then we'll move to a polling question, guys, is don't think this is an all or nothing analysis, okay? So I've focused in a lot on industry data and avoiding that pitfall moving into your readiness plan early on. But keep in mind, there may be certain segments that you've recently entered into that are just not big for you, but there are other segments that are. Let's say that you've got a very large used auto portfolio, but you're just getting into real estate lending, right? You've got unsecured consumer stuff, you've got used and new auto, but real estate is new for you. Or maybe you've just recently got into some commercial loans. Again, keep in mind that maybe your historical loss information may be very good for those portfolios you've had a large population for over time, but maybe there's other populations that you just don't have good history for. Those are ones to identify early on and think about how you can close that gap with industry data as compared ultimately to just having to have nothing there and adjust for it qualitatively. With that, Amy, I think we'll move into our next polling question.
All right, thank you, Derek. So the second polling question is, what data set are you using or planning to use within your CECL model? A, peer or industry data, B, my own historical data, C, combination of peer and my own data, or D, not applicable, just here for the CPE. And as a reminder, if you would like to receive CPE for today's webcast, you will need to respond to at least 3 of the 4 polling questions.
And Derek, when we look at the results of this, can you kind of circle back, and we're getting a lot of questions like we expected in terms of not a lot of loss history. Accountants and auditors like to say, well, no loss history is a loss history. And then the response back is typically, well, that didn't really help very much in terms of trying to get to an allowance that's reasonable. And you talked a little bit about the peer data, but when we look at these results, can you kind of circle back around of how you kind of hit home how you use peer data, or how Valuant views that in terms of establishing loss rates when you don't have your own loss rates?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
All right, here are the results.
All right, 42% of the respondents, almost 43, said a combination of both peer industry data and my own data. And then, great for the audience here, 27% feel like they may be able to use their own historical data. Gabe, it's a great question on, okay, I have my own historical data, but it's resulting in 10 to 20 basis points worth of coverage. And now we've got competing forces, quite honestly, right? We've got audit, and we've got validation, we've got math, quite honestly, in some cases, defending the fact that that's where the model shakes out. However, you've got a regulatory and a peer industry that would say that ultimately that might not be enough under this analysis. What do I do here in this situation? The first thing you need to do is identify, if you are having your own historical information but no historical loss, why that is. And is that practical to assume moving forward? Generally speaking, no. Okay? Typically, when you think about historical loss information, just because you haven't observed historical loss does not mean in the future that you will not observe historical loss. Right? You can't take those one for one. However, if historically speaking, you've observed less loss maybe than a peer group, I think typically that can point into it. However, one thing that I would say practically of how this is applied is you would want to run the same model under both your own data and the industry data to see where you're wildly different. And that concept is called benchmarking. And so you want to ensure you're able to benchmark if you are using your own historical loss data against the peer data set of why that might be. Keep in mind, this is a risk management technique as much as it is, quite honestly, a direct accounting standard pull through, because you're projecting now in this accounting standard a reasonable and supportable forecast. So in most cases, from a reasonable and supportable forecast standpoint, especially where we stand today, if your historical loss is not observed, something that's easily forecasted, looking to that peer data set might allow you to close that gap. So with that, guys, we'll move into the next section, which is the pitfall that, while it's not the most time-consuming, it might be the most technical. Because not a lot of people ultimately have worked through this concept of forecasting. You do some form of forecasting interest rate risk, asset liability management practices today. But in practically applying that to your balance sheet and recording it against your actual income statement, that's not something you've done until you adopted CECL. And so there's some key concepts that you really need to consider where you're working through. And the pitfall ultimately that we typically see is that you have a major focus on running your models, but those models have just given you a long-term average of historical loss. It has not given you a specific assumption around your reasonable and supportable forecast. And that can become a problem, because if you just run, let's say, a vintage model as an example. If you run a simple vintage model, you're going to be looking historically over that vintage model, but you're not going to be looking at the concepts of how your composition may change into the future or where those losses may change. The assumption that you're inherently making by running that vintage model is that your future expected loss within the periods are going to be exactly equal to what your historicals have been without any tying to a specific economic forecast. So ensure when you're thinking through the models that you're working through and calibrating those models that the concept of forecasting is entering into those. Now, there's three common forecast approaches that we see within the industry. And those are outlined here below, and we'll go through a couple of examples of those here today. The first is what we call a mechanical forecast or a statistical forecast that might be tied to macro or microeconomic variables. And ultimately what that might mean, and we've got a good example here, is looking forward to the unemployment rate or GDP rate or interest rates. Obviously, the FOMC will announce today another rate hike in just a few hours my time as you would work through it. So having those factors essentially influencing your model results into the future. The second is a quantitative range. It's very similar to item one, but it's not regression driven. So you guys probably heard the terminology before, correlation studies or regression studies. It's still more quantitative in nature, but it's ranges based on historical look-back periods. And the third are qualitative scorecards, which are quickly turning into one of the bigger methods that might be used for those smaller adopters in 2023. For most adopters within 21, 22, some early adopted, and then obviously 21 as well with some COVID delays, items 1 and 2 or approaches 1 and 2 were the most heavily used. There weren't a lot of forecasting techniques being conducted through qualitative factor scorecard ranges, and most were done mechanically here. And it was just a natural transition, guys, from the models that some organizations were using for credit stress testing. And that's really why, from a percentage standpoint, it just naturally worked through that. However, as the smaller banks and financial services companies have begun to adopt CECL, they see the benefits of this, right? Because ultimately they can forecast an economic variable that's coming from their interest rate risk provider, and it can influence their model in a way that they were practically doing a little bit more judgmentally before. And so off to the side, I got some key terms. Everyone should know these, and within their CECL documentation should clearly outline what their assumptions are, the elections that they've made, because these are key terms and key assumptions in your modeling that have been pulled out of ASC 326 and put into here. I'm going to go through a couple of those that are the more important before we talk about specific examples of how to avoid these pitfalls and get past them. And the first terminology that I'm going to talk through is more finance-related in nature, but it's this concept of a long-term average or through-the-cycle rate and point-in-time rate. Guys, when you start to work into CECL, you need to know these two terms because they're very important. But they're also important for any economic analysis that you might work through. But again, the through-the-cycle, or TTC, is the long-term average rate. And again, if you just look over 20 years' worth of history, you get your average loss rate, that's your long-term average. However, at any point in that 20-year history, there's been different loss rates on those curves, okay? And that is a point in time. This concept of through the cycle and point in time is exactly what CECL is doing. It's aimed at accuracy of the reasonable and supportable forecast before you work back to the long-term average. So as we move into what a point in time rate may be, there's practically 3 or 4 terms that are pulled out of ASC 326 that really matter for your model results. The first that I've got on the screen is a reasonable and supportable forecast period. So the standard is ask everyone to forecast. It didn't say you had to forecast forever. Most economic forecasts that exist out there on an average 12 to 24 months. And that's what we typically see in models as they are deployed. Most people are not forecasting past 3 years. That would be very, very difficult to do, especially in the environment that we exist in today. Now, after you get past that forecasting period, you then have to revert back to the long-term average loss rate. Well, what time period do you do that over? Obviously, like everything else with CECL, it's flexible. Most often we're seeing periods of 24 months there. That's about the average time it's taken in any trough or peak to get back to the long-term average on certain macroeconomic variables. A few different other ones ultimately to point out here, but I want to focus in on macroeconomic variables because that's how the reasonable and supportable forecast may work through. So again, we'll talk about mechanical forecasting, but let's make it simple from a qualitative standpoint. If you're looking at different macroeconomic variables today, you need to think about how those are going to be influencing your losses into the future. I've named out a few here, but unemployment rates, local or national, with the labor market are widely used throughout the industry today. Inflation rates are something that's come in obviously over the last year as those have begun to influence consumer spending and even businesses in a lot of situations here. And then growth rates and price indices. Now, there's other models that exist out there that take different things into account, but most of the models are going to accomplish these things. And you need to think about these early on. Because if you're working through and you're establishing the same qualitative factor framework that you're using today, just deploying it back up against your new CECL model, some of these concepts may be in there, but you've been prohibited from forecasting what these are going to do into the future. You've been looking just at what those current rates are today to see how they might be influencing your balance sheet. Again, it's a totally different paradigm as you move into CECL, and you've got to be clearly painting that picture that you are thinking about how these rates are being forecasted into the future. So let's work through a practical example here of a mechanical forecast or a statistical forecast. So there's a lot of information. I'll kind of go through at high level for everyone. But the first is using a vendor type of model, using that industry data like we talked about. So again, we've got an industry data set. There's other companies that have an industry data set. If that's the case, there's typically things that are influencing those models. As an example, the type of loan that it is, what type of credit quality indicator, with risk rating, or on the consumer side, maybe it's a credit score. Maybe there's delinquency statuses from a roll rate perspective that you're looking to. There's going to be other things that might be needed. Obviously, one that stands out is the balance of the loan. So the first step in this process would just be mapping your data into this industry model to be able to use it. Next, there's going to be a forecast of these loss rates based on a regression equation. It's just math. There's going to be a correlation study that's looked back over the data set of losses compared to a macroeconomic variable, in this case, the national unemployment rate. One thing that I will say is, typically speaking, in these models, there are some flexibility for the organizations to choose varying reasonable and supportable forecast periods and reversion periods. So that's not true in all models that exist out there, but most models would offer that flexibility. Some organizations might feel they're comfortable forecasting for 2 years. Others may say, I can only forecast for a year reasonably and need to be able to support it. So typically speaking, there should be some flexibility that you would have when applying your model, because you're going to want to test these things as you work through them. So here up to the right side, guys, let's say the long-term loss rate, this is for a commercial owner-occupied real estate property, is 0.75%. That's the long-term loss rate over 20 years. If we look at that industry data, again, like I talked about, it's got the regression equation tied to unemployment rate. So what the organization does is they source a forecast from their asset liability management source, interest rate risk, and they get a source of unemployment rate over the next 12 months is going to be 7%. So based on that math equation with the regression study, if the unemployment rate's at 7%, the model is suggesting that the loss rate would be 1.25%. And they're doing that over that 12-month forecast period that we just talked about. So if we've checked the box on reasonable and supportable forecasts, that's great. Now we've got loans and receivables, obviously, that might have a life longer than 12 months. And so what do we do for the remaining time periods around those expected lives? That's when we move into a reasonable and supportable forecast. Now, this institution has chosen a straight line basis. So what that means is from months 13 to 24, they're going to start at 0.75 and they're going to work their way up until by the 24th month, they're using an annualized loss rate there of 1.25%. And then lastly, anything in that 25th month and forward, they're going to be using that long-term average loss rate that we worked through before. Now, one important part of these models, again, when you're thinking about the pitfalls, is let's say you've got the data, you've got that checked off, you're forecasting, but you haven't really tested out what the model is going to do in these different scenarios. And we're running into this all the time when we think about CECL implementations. Because practically what's going on here, guys, is we're in a scenario over the last 2 years of kind of extreme economic conditions from one period to the next. Okay, most of our lifetimes, this is the first pandemic that we're working into. And now, since the 70s, we're working into a basis of very high inflation, and what is that going to do? Most models do not have data back to the 70s to be able to build models off of, and so that's very difficult to think through. So the concept there and the pitfall that you want to avoid is when you're establishing these models, make sure you run different scenarios. Yes, I understand we're trying to build this model as of 6/30/2022 and 9/30/2022, but think about going back and running that same model at the height of COVID to see what it did. Think about running that model in a more normalized time frame as it may look back from historical losses. Because ultimately what we've seen in very many situations is that a model was deployed that worked for that date just to discover later that there were issues with it when you work to different extremes. And you want to know how those models are going to react, because ultimately that might tell you some things that are out there. I've got several different things outlined here, and again, I'll work through a couple of these that are the most important when you're thinking about what to avoid and these challenges that you might enter into. If you are moving down that path as a mechanical forecaster, or already down that path, the validation audit teams are going to have obviously some technical people involved. And there's just various academic statistical tests that have to be run and evaluated before you can just use the model. I'll give an example of this, something pretty simple of the fit of the model. So you might run a regression study to say that you did it, but there's no evaluation over how effective that model is. So let's say you've got a correlation factor of only 10%. Well, if anybody jumps in there, they're going to say, yeah, I mean, you developed a forecast model, but it's only explaining 10% of the variability. That's not very strong. And so that's definitely something to key in and make sure that you're working through. Item 2 that I want to point out, and I can't stress this enough, CECL is already complicated. Don't overcomplicate it. I know we want to explore a bunch of different macroeconomic factors, but a lot of those are very similar. Okay, if you go back and you look at how GDP, unemployment rate, interest rates may interact with one another. They've interacted with each other pretty consistently. The one I would say that maybe not is around indices and price indices. Be careful trying to correlate those two together because in some situations, asset values continue to decline or continue to move up, different than perhaps the labor markets might show. So ensure that you're not picking various leads and lags and different external variables between different platforms. Just make sure, again, you've got to be able to make sure you're checking the box on that pitfall of doing a forecast, but you don't want to get so complicated that you can't explain it and it's not stable and durable into the future. And again, I've already pointed it out, but I want to point it out again, is just unexpected results. You have to test these models in different situations, guys, that you would work through. And with that, I think we've got another polling question for the group.
All right. So our third polling question, how are you accomplishing or planning to address reasonable and supportable forecasts? A, statistical or mechanical. B, quantitative ranges against economic variables. C, qualitative framework. Or D, not applicable here for the CPE.
Derek, we're getting a number of questions in terms of applicability and the things we're talking about, and I think it's probably good to step back a little bit. And from my view, and obviously looking for your view as well, from my view, a lot of what we're talking about here today is things that are applicable to institutions as they approach that billion, and definitely as they cross and are over that 1 billion mark. And you're not required to do a lot of this stuff. The smaller institutions do have other options, more basic options. The Fed put out a scale model. It's not really compatible necessarily with credit unions, but they could follow something similar. There's the WARM model that was issued by the FASB, which nothing's perfect, but you can approach these things internally. The smaller you are, the more we are seeing people keep it internally and not hiring vendors and things like that. But as you get more sophisticated, you're going to want a little more control over the estimate and meeting the spirit of the standard. So the $1 billion to me is very much a line of demarcation. And as you approach that, we are seeing, I would say, a majority of institutions that we work with are getting some level of assistance because it's a challenging standard to meet. Thoughts on that?
I think you're exactly right. And some of these concepts that we might be working through and discussing from a pitfall standpoint, because those are the organizations that have adopted today, those same concepts be taken and scaled down significantly for smaller institutions. Right? We're talking about forecasting and how your model might respond, but if you've got a simple model, it's just a charge-off model, like a snapshot model, and you're looking to losses over the last 10 years that you have, and adjusting it qualitatively based on management's knowledge, keep in mind on that, guys, that you still need to know how the models are going to react in different situations. I was actually talking with a smaller organization this morning that has a very simple CECL model. However, when they moved across 22 and they really picked it back up and doing full parallel runs, their framework that they established, continues to have reserves being lowered period over period because of the way that they built it out. So again, Gabe, you make a really good point that even if you're building those things internally, and some of the sophistication may not be as exact as some of the items we're talking through, you still have to ensure the concepts are still there, and those basic concepts. And those pitfalls are still there. Your data, your ability to forecast. You've got to do it. And then obviously we'll work into documentation around that as well. It's a great point.
All right, I'm going to pull up the results here.
All right, great. So vast majority, around 50%, said that they were doing something quantitatively, whether that's statistically driven through regression or mechanical forecast, or if it's still a quantitative range comparing to economic factors, not specifically through a regression. And again, that makes sense to me based on what I've seen and what I continue to see, because people are getting a bit frustrated with not being able to tie to something specifically, and it makes the life a little bit easier as you work through actually utilizing and establishing in establishing that model. So the last point on the pitfalls that we want to clearly outline here are model validation and its role in the CECL adoption. Now, Gabe just brought up that $1 billion threshold, regardless of commercial credit union status. That is one that regulatory bodies have kind of keyed on in specifically as we think about model validation. However, please keep in mind, model validation is going to certainly be different across the size of the organization. We have mentioned two different regulatory standards that exist out there. All interagencies have accepted these. The NCUA is not specifically issued model risk management framework, but they do point to the existing other interagency policies as you work through. The point of a model validation, though, guys, is many different things, but again, it comes in different shapes and sizes based on the size and complexity of the organization. We've got 4 of those that we want to work through today and specifically mention to you guys. And some of these, again, are going to be more detailed just based on the size and the complexity of your model that you're working through. But the first thing it has to do is ensure that what's established in GAAP and the methodologies that have chosen check the boxes on those items that are there within the standard. Now, talking about an internally developed model versus a vendor model, one thing the vendor models are able to do is, obviously because they've already been through this before, they're kind of a little bit more easily able to check that box, and there's probably some standard documentation that helps align that for a validator and auditor that might come in. If you're using your own internal models or using some of the Fed's tools that they have placed out there, just ensure that you've got documentation that says, this is what the ASC says, and this is how I'm adhering to that. Because again, you've got to have something that says, I thought about this and that's why I did. Second is actually checking the mathematical accuracy of that model. And that's where most people are going to spend a lot of time within a validation and in the support of that audit. That's just going to be saying, look, this is what my model is supposed to be doing mathematically, and reperforming that to ensure that it's both accurate and it's sound from a theoretical standpoint. Now, the third is a similar concept that I just talked about on the second pitfall of determining your models. It is going to look at the consistency of the concepts of that model being applied to your portfolio. And it's going to be testing those under different situations, and that's a very important part of model validation of what you would expect should you go down that path. Because again, the concept that will ultimately be coming through and very critical is, does this model practically align with my portfolio? And how am I defending and documenting that I could use this for my portfolio? And the fourth, that we put on here not least, is documentation. So a lot of these things that we talk through are very difficult in terms of accomplishing without defending why you did that. And that's what documentation is. That's really all it is as you work through this, is ensuring that someone coming in to review understands why you made the decisions that you made, regardless of the level of complexity. When we think about documentation here, it doesn't mean you have to have 40 pages of a model document around CECL. However, if you don't have any document that says, I sourced this information from here, this is what I did to confirm that it's accurate, these are the peers that I picked and why I picked them, no reviewer can come in there and feel comfortable that the model's performing because they don't know why you made the decisions that you made. Now, that's probably something someone could sit down and talk with you about as you develop the documentation, but it would certainly make your life easier if you would go ahead and have that down in some documents. Not only that, it would also help with any transition that maybe you have internally. If you have someone owning the process internally that then moves on, to a different organization or whatever the fact is, that's much more easily translated, and getting that knowledge for your institution or your organization in paper form can be very, very beneficial. Now, guys, we've got a slide here that shows a documentation checklist. Please use this to your benefit. This should be something, if you're not working with someone else, you have a clear understanding what documents and what items you need to be clearly addressing. One item I want to clearly point out onto here is if you are using a vendor, such as Valuant, or there's others out there, you can't just take their model documentation and say, look, I've got a vendor, I've got their model documentation. That's enough. Now, if you do that, you may have a lot of those boxes checked, but there's still decisions that you have to make, and you have to document why you made those decisions and why you agree with ultimately how that vendor platform is working through. Now, over here on the documentation checklist, there's several things that I do want to point out to you guys specifically in the pitfalls that we talked about. One is that data. Ensure you have something saying where you got the data from, how you became comfortable with it, whether that could just be simple reconciliations back to general ledger or external filings. Based on how you're segmenting the portfolio, let's say you are using the scale tool or the ELE tool that the Fed has put out, why are those segmenting classes that are available there in those models okay to use in your model? What happens if you've got a marine portfolio or a historical consumer-based portfolio that doesn't really fit into those segments and don't need to be carved out? Explain how you're coming up with that. And then, again, very much documentation is defending yourself on your forecast and reversions and how you're forecasting, whether that might be simple, qualitative, or more complex through a mechanical forecast. Amy, with that, I think we would move into our last polling question and then take some questions.
All right, thank you. So our last question is, how often are you planning on having a formal validation completed? A, annually, B, biannually, C, not planning on having formal validation, or D, here for the CPE?
And Derek, not to jump your commentary on the results there, this is a topic that's come up quite a bit at the Depository Institution Expert Panel, and a lot of people are interested in having validations done, particularly initially, but there's no prescribed time that you have to do it. It kind of falls in within the risk assessment of the modeling, and at least every couple of years seems to be an answer that comes up quite a bit. But some definitely are looking at it annually, without a doubt. And then, so we'll see the results here and take your comments there, and then we'll try to squeeze in a question on qualitative factors and how you support those, and I'll formulate the question after we get through the results here.
Sounds good. It's around 44% annually, 25% biannually, and then about 10% not planning on having a formal validation. I would say the frequency of that we've seen, Gabe, is very much based on the size of the organization. All right, if you're 5 to 10 billion, doing that annually is probably going to be within the risk management practices that the regulators are going to be looking to. As you work down that scale, certainly every couple of years, and maybe even you're doing it in different capacities, right? You've got a full validation that you might be having completed every 2 years, and then you're doing some internal audit practices, or you're doing some recalculation internally with validations in between those time periods to ensure that the model is continuing to perform as you would expect it to perform. And again, what we've really seen on that is that $1 billion threshold, like we talked about. That's very, very important from a model validation. But as we work through the smaller organizations, we have seen very much a desire to do that, especially like you talked about in that first year. And then we can reassess, because it's the first time I'm adopting that model. I want to make sure that it's clearly checking all the boxes that I needed to check before I come in for an external audit and something's found that I didn't really think through.
Okay, let's try to squeeze in one with a minute left. How does Valuant view the documentation and support when you've got your historical losses? We look at that and we say, well, doesn't seem like enough. We've got the forecast that would then maybe drive an adjustment to those historical losses. Valuant's approach to adjusting the historical losses, can you summarize that in 30 seconds to 60 seconds? I know that's almost unfair. But.
No, I think I'll give it a shot. Two different ways. If it's statistical, the model handles it, the math handles it. Qualitatively, what most people are doing on that situation is two things. One is just establishing anchors. Okay, what is my model giving me versus if I look back qualitatively to different time periods, what were my maximum losses that might have been observed? Okay, that's giving me a range that's easily defended. And then I'm able to carve out ranges within those time periods against economic factors. The second is to clearly identify where risks are not accounted for in the model. And one that's practically there are risk ratings or credit scores. Okay, and so if I don't have that as a segmentation into my model qualitatively, I have to be ensured that I can able to apply that to assume where those adjustments might need to be made.
I appreciate that. And we'll turn back to Amy to wrap us up. And if you did not get your question responded to, we will follow up with you.
All right, thank you, Gabe, and thank you, Derek, for a great presentation today. And to our attendees, if you met all CPE requirements, your certificate is available to download now in the CPE progress window. A copy will be emailed within 3 weeks should you have difficulty downloading it now. And finally, here's a link to an online survey for today's presentation. And thank you for joining our webcast. We hope you'll join us again next time. Take care, everyone.